Unlike Walt Disney World, Universal is known for taking out old rides and old lands and replacing them with newer IPs and more innovative rides. Now, part of the reason for this is because of obviously competition with Disney. They have to continue improving their park in order to take away attendance from Disney and be able to get on the same level as them. However, of course, the other reason for this is simply because they don't have the same amount of land that Disney does. Disney has land the size of San Francisco, whereas Universal is pretty much landlocked as far as where their theme parks are actually located. They can't simply build a new attraction in the middle of their park on open land. They can't simply do that. Velocicoaster even, you might think, oh, well, that's not replacing anything. Well, it is replacing old attractions that have been closed for years, like the Triceratops Encounter. And of course is also being weaved throughout the land and getting rid of many trees, so it wasn't necessarily easy to get in there. This trend started for Universal around 2004 when they got rid of the very popular Confrontation for Revenge of the Mummy, essentially proving that nothing was sacred or safe at Universal and that they were willing to get rid of anything and everything to improve the park, essentially going by what Walt Disney himself's strategy was going into building Disneyland, where he wanted to continue evolving. But effectively, because of how nostalgic people became for the original attractions, they inevitably had to stick around, and Disneyland, as well as inevitably Walt Disney World, have become rather stagnant, at least up until about 2010, once Universal built the Wizarding World, forcing Disney to actually start making changes. But now with Disney actually making changes and improving their parks, the pressure on Universal to continue improving is even greater than had been in the past. As now they've gained some market share in the Orlando market, they could easily lose it if they remain stagnant. And with the industry trending towards more immersive, single IP, completely themed lands, the question becomes, what land will Universal replace next? Of course, with Epic Universe on the way, the timeline for these changes could be very far away, with Epic Universe most likely not expected to open until at the very earliest 2025 at this point due to the COVID delays. And chances are, with the pandemic slowing down tourism and attendance at these parks, there's a good chance that we won't see Universal get rid of one of these lands and replace them with something completely new until probably after Epic Universe opens, unless Epic Universe continues to get delayed. With that being said, let's hop right into it and let's start with KidZone. Woody Woodpecker's KidZone is one of the oldest, least changed lands in all of Universal. The land opened up with the park back in 1990. Of course, it's very different from when it opened then, but still finds itself being very outdated, with the most recent attraction being added there being Woody Woodpecker's Nut House Coaster back in 1999. On top of this, it's probably the least themed, least aesthetically pleasing land in all of the park, just looking completely disgusting at every turn. And if not to make things worse for this land, as far as it's sticking around, it's also probably one of the most empty lands on any given day at the park. Another thing to note going into this is that KidZone was actually set up for demolishment not too long ago, back in 2018, and was set to be taken over by Super Nintendo World. Of course, ET was not included with these plans, as that seems to be becoming the only sacred thing in all of Universal, and rumor is that that's because Steven Spielberg himself really likes that ride and does not want it going anywhere. So it was left out of the plans. However, the plans ended up getting scrapped because shortly after filing those permits, Universal got the rights to build their new theme park, Epic Universe, on their newly acquired land. So Universal decided, well, Super Nintendo World's a pretty big IP, let's save it for Epic Universe. Thus, of course, leaving KidZone around. And now, because of Epic Universe delayment, it's still here even longer than I think most of us would have expected. The newest rumor for this land is that Pokemon will take it over, which, if that is actually to be the case, chances are it 100% will not be replaced until after Epic Universe is open for at least a year. As far as the feasibility of this being the first land for them to replace, I think it's pretty likely because 1, you have a lot of land to work with, 2, a lot of the buildings and structures there are very easy to replace, a lot of it's actually fairly open land, and so long as you replace it with a kid-related property, you're not really losing anything major from the park that you would necessarily need as far as keeping it very balanced. So when we're talking about likelihood of being replaced, KidZone's gotta be S tier. right? That is a very high likelihood that this land goes away soon. Though, obviously having been around for so long, it's proven to be surprisingly resilient, so don't sleep on it sticking around. Now we're going to go ahead and jump on over to Islands of Adventure and talk about the Lost Continent, probably the second most talked about land as far as getting replaced. Now, obviously, big reason for this because there's only one attraction there, Poseidon's Fury, which of course has been closed now for months due to COVID. And outside of a few other restaurants, there's not really much to talk about with this land as far as what's there. Of course, the theming is beautiful and the soundtrack is amazing, but this land doesn't really offer too much. That being said, it doesn't really offer that much as a replacement candidate either, and the reason being is that it doesn't really take up a whole lot of land. With Harry Potter having taken half of its land, it left Lost Continent with a fairly small footprint that it's currently operating on, which of course doesn't leave it out of the possibility of getting replaced, but it makes it less likely that major IPs like Nintendo could go here because you typically want a larger footprint, a larger land to be able to work with those kind of IPs. The major rumor here, as there have been speculations for Nintendo finding their way in each Universal Orlando park, is that The Legend of Zelda will take over here. And I could see that definitely happening. I mean, Zelda probably is the least popular of the three between Mario and Pokemon, actually 100% is. And as a result, probably doesn't need the biggest land. On top of that, it's a fairly unique IP in the grand offering of not only Islands of Adventure, but also Universal Studios Florida. Now, unlike KidZone, where you pretty much have to tear down almost everything there when building a new land, when it comes to Lost Continent, because it has some of these high quality restaurants and plenty of infrastructure built for stores and whatnot, you can actually leave a lot of the infrastructure there, like they did for the Wizarding World when they took over that second half of Lost Continent, leaving Dueling Dragons, leaving Flying Unicorn, and leaving many of the restaurants and shops and simply changing their facades and interiors while keeping the actual building structures there. I think to a certain extent with the Zelda theme, you can pretty much leave Mythos almost completely untouched and it would still work pretty well within that theme. Now, if you had asked me before COVID the likelihood of Lost Continent going away anytime soon or being the first to go away, I probably would have said, I don't really see it happening, and the main reason for that is because Poseidon's Fury is such a great people eater. That takes people out of the park for a substantially long amount of time just because of how long that experience is. However, with COVID having it closed for so long, the need for that type of ride is starting to dwindle, and they'd rather have a ride that can actually survive through something like this. So as much as I like the Lost Continent for its theming and its soundtrack, I think it's very, very likely that we see it turn to Zelda. We get at least one ride, maybe a show, and then you just re-theme the restaurants and shops, and there it goes. And honestly, like as far as a cheaper option, I almost see it more likely as KidZone going away because, like I said, KidZone has to basically be completely torn down. But it really depends on what type of land they want to build first. If they really prioritize getting Pokemon out there because of its popularity, they'll go with KidZone first. But if they're okay going with Zelda and building a cheaper, more efficiently built land, then they can go with that. Now, I've already talked about probably the two most likely and most talked about lands for replacement, that being Lost Continent and KidZone. That being said, there are some other candidates who are honestly more interesting to talk about because they are a bit more controversial candidates, whereas everyone can pretty much agree, well, KidZone has to go, it's outdated, and oh well, Lost Continent has to go, it doesn't really offer that much. A lot of people are going to disagree on these other potential removal candidates. And of course, the first one of those being Toon Lagoon. Toon Lagoon offers some of the greatest water rides, I think maybe even the world. I mean, I'm not even kidding. Like these, I mean, for me personally, Popeye and Dudley are the two best water rides I've ever ridden. They get you more wet than any water rides that I've ever been on outside of an actual water park. However, that's not everyone's cup of tea, so a lot of people don't really like this land because for people who don't necessarily like getting soaked, they don't care for this land and they don't ride the rides. On top of this, the theme for the land is fairly outdated. Yes, there's a good amount of people who know who Popeye is, but honestly, most of the other IPs in this land are fairly unknown at this moment, especially Dudley, who honestly, even when this ride was built, was not really a super well-known property within the United States. That being said, I think with Dudley and Popeye, as well as Jurassic Park River Adventure, Islands of Adventure has honestly probably the best collection of water rides at maybe any dry theme park in the entire world. I'm willing to honestly stand by that. Like, that is it's such an incredible collection of water rides of varying levels of wetness and ride type. So here's the thing: do I think that the land itself will completely go away one day? Honestly, no. And here's the reason why. It's because those water rides are so immensely popular. Not only, like I said, does it make Islands of Adventure a better park for having that collection of water rides, but also, over the summer, during this hot Florida heat and humidity, those rides are getting some of the longest waits in the park. People love those rides and they're willing to wait long amount of times for them, especially when the weather permits for it. So even though there are a percentage of people who will never, ever ride those rides, there's still nonetheless a huge audience for those type of rides. And getting rid of them is certainly do a disservice to the quality of the park. On top of that, demolishing rides like that just so happen to be connected to the main lagoon of the park would be extremely expensive and time consuming, as well as pretty difficult. So I think there are more likely two possibilities for what can happen in this land. Either one, we see a retheme. Obviously a pretty popular target is SpongeBob. However, let's be honest, they've had the rights to SpongeBob for a long time, and it seemed like a no-brainer for a long time to just change it to SpongeBob, but I think that Universal is trying to stay away from properties they don't own, and when they do go to a property that they don't own, they want it to be like a proven winner, something they can really have faith in. And yes, you might say, oh, well, SpongeBob is a proven winner. Here's the thing, though. SpongeBob is old. It's old at this point, you know? It's been around for a very long time. Universal, probably at this point, is not super confident in the longevity of that property outside of building a store for it, right? Though I do think it would be an awesome retheme and a very well fit one. I mean, hell, build the Krusty Krab, that's a no-brainer. You'll make so much money off of it. But still, I don't know how likely that is. I think that actually the other possibility might be more likely, and I think that is getting rid of the Toon Lagoon Theater and those games over there, as well as possibly Comic Strip Cafe, and making that into its own land and essentially leaving Toon Lagoon as just the two water rides. This would provide an ample amount of space, more space than what Lost Continent provides, as well as a fairly open area to work with. Not only could you keep the existing store and restaurant layouts that they have in the Comic Strip Lane area, but it'd be fairly easy to bulldoze and demolish the land that Toon Lagoon Theater and those games currently reside on. As far as what can go here, something that's been very popular and heavily rumored is Lord of the Rings. Like I said, I don't think that they would do the whole of Toon Lagoon, replace the Lord of the Rings, but I could see them taking out a big chunk of it, like I said, the Toon Lagoon Theater area and the Comic Strip Lane area, and I can absolutely see them replacing that with Lord of the Rings and keeping the two water rides to keep those people who need those rides and love those rides happy. And now the last land that I'm going to talk about today is World Expo. This is not a land that's typically talked about or heavily rumored to be replaced, but it takes up quite a good amount of space. There is only two attractions here, Men in Black, as well as Fear Factor, which of course, again, has not been open since the pandemic started. Now, although Men in Black is a well-liked, somewhat popular ride within the park, there is some concern about its growing age, as well as the fact that the manufacturer who made it went out of business, thus causing there to be a shortage of supplies to repair the ride. Same thing goes for Cat in the Hat and Islands of Adventure, which is of course already seen the terrible side of that, with the spinning being lost and the rest of the ride basically going to absolute garbage, and the ride now being basically the worst ride in the entire park. But that's a topic for another video, okay? Let's get back to topic here. World Expo is a prime target for replacement. Reason being is that there's a lot of open land here. There's not a whole lot of like heavy theming going on in this land, and a lot of it's just trees that can be easily bulldozed and replaced. On top of this, both attractions in this land are pretty old at this point. They've been around for quite some time. And if you look at previous closures from Universal, you'll notice that usually when you hit around the 20-year mark, you're usually in danger of getting replaced. Men in Black just hit its 20-year mark last year, and Fear Factor will hit it in 2025. So if we're talking about potentially replacing a land after Epic Universe, World Expo is primed for it. There's not really much here outside of those 2 attractions either. There's no real restaurants or shops or anything like that outside of some gift shops, right? There's so much potential for the space that just isn't being talked about, and I don't know if that's because people don't want to see Men in Black go away, or it's because people just don't realize how valuable and how much potential there is for this space given what it is currently. Now, as far as what can go here, since there hasn't really been much talk about replacing this land, I have no idea. But you have plenty of space to make it work, whatever it is you decide to do. And I think that that is something that they just simply cannot pass up on. And I think that actually it's going to be a prime suspect for replacement, certainly more than Toon Lagoon will. And I think that that's something to look out for in 2025 or past 2025 when this topic comes up again. So with that being said, let me know in the comments what you guys thought of what I had to say here today and what you think is going to be the first land to be replaced. Do you think it's going to go before Epic Universe opens or afterwards? Do you think that what I said about these lands being plausible to go away is true, or do you think that they're going to stick around for longer than what I think they are? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.